At the very beginning of the Reformation, something almost unbelievable was taking shape, an unlikely curiosity between two worlds that barely understood each other. Early Protestants, rising in defiance against Rome, began looking east and noticed something intriguing: an ancient church that had already rejected papal authority centuries earlier. To them, this felt like validation. Figures like Martin Luther pointed to the Eastern Church as proof that Christianity didn't need the Pope to survive. Meanwhile, scholars such as Philip Melanchthon went even further, reaching out in hopes of building a connection. Letters were sent, ideas were shared. There was even an attempt to translate Protestant beliefs into Greek, making them accessible to Orthodox leaders. For a brief moment, it looked like a powerful alliance could form, one that might reshape Christianity entirely. But beneath that surface-level agreement was a dangerous assumption that both sides were fighting the same battle. And as soon as they began to truly understand each other, that illusion started to crack in ways no one expected.
The turning point came not with war or violence, but with words. When the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople finally responded to Protestant outreach, it wasn't the friendly acknowledgement many in the West had hoped for. Instead, it was a detailed and methodical breakdown of Protestant beliefs, one that exposed just how deep the divide really was. Each major idea presented by the Protestants was examined, and many were labeled not just incorrect, but completely incompatible with Orthodox faith. What had seemed like minor differences suddenly looked like unbridgeable gaps. Still, the conversation didn't end immediately. Letters continued to pass back and forth, each side masterfully explaining itself, hoping the other might come around. But instead of growing closer, the exchanges only made the disagreements clearer. By 1581, the tone had shifted completely. The Patriarch, recognizing that no agreement could be reached, politely but firmly asked the Protestants to stop writing altogether. Just like that, the closest moment of unity between these two worlds came to an abrupt and quiet end, closing a door that would never reopen.
At first glance, the Orthodox and the Protestants seemed to share a powerful common ground. Both rejected the authority of the Pope. But that apparent agreement masked a much deeper misunderstanding. For Protestants, the issue was rooted in Scripture. They believed that if something wasn't clearly supported by the Bible, it had no place in the Church, and the papacy, in their eyes, failed that test entirely. The Orthodox, however, saw things very differently. They didn't deny the historical importance of Rome or even the role of its bishop. What they rejected was the idea that Rome had elevated itself above all others. To them, the Pope wasn't illegitimate, just overreaching. This distinction changed everything. Protestants were trying to dismantle a system they believed was fundamentally flawed. The Orthodox were trying to preserve a balance they believed had been broken. So while both sides appeared to stand against the same authority, they were doing so for entirely different reasons. And that meant any attempt at unity was built on a misunderstanding from the very start. As discussions deepened, the real conflict came into focus, not over politics, but over the very foundation of faith itself. One of the most explosive differences was the idea of authority. Protestants pushed the concept that Scripture alone should guide belief, arguing that every Christian could interpret the Bible directly. To the Orthodox, this idea was not just wrong, it was dangerous. Their faith was built on centuries of tradition, guided by councils, theologians, and shared understanding. Removing that structure didn't feel like a return to purity, it felt like chaos. And the disagreements didn't stop there. Practices that were central to Orthodox life, like honoring saints or venerating the Virgin Mary, were dismissed by Protestants as excessive or even inappropriate. Monasteries, which held deep spiritual importance, were rejected outright. Even core rituals like communion were interpreted differently. These weren't small theological debates, they were direct challenges to how people lived their faith every single day. To many Orthodox believers, Protestant ideas didn't just seem unfamiliar, they felt like an attack on everything sacred. While the Reformation spread rapidly in Western Europe, fueled by anger and frustration, the same energy simply didn't exist in the Orthodox world, and the reason was surprisingly simple. Most people didn't feel the same pressure. In the West, many lived under systems where the Catholic Church had direct influence over daily life, often in ways that caused resentment. Reform offered a sense of relief, even liberation. But in the East, the situation was completely different. Orthodox Christians weren't under the authority of Rome, so the corruption Protestants were rebelling against didn't impact them in the same way. In fact, for many living under Ottoman rule, stability was far more valuable than change. Any kind of religious upheaval carried serious risks, not just spiritually but politically. Supporting a movement like the Reformation could bring consequences that went far beyond theological disagreement. So while Protestants saw an opportunity for transformation, Orthodox communities saw something else entirely: uncertainty, instability, and danger. And without widespread support from ordinary people, no movement, no matter how powerful, could take hold. In the West, the success of the Reformation wasn't just about ideas, it was about power. Rulers saw an opportunity to break free from the influence of Rome and strengthen their own authority. By supporting Protestant movements, they could seize church lands, control religious institutions, and reshape their kingdoms. But in the Orthodox world, that same incentive simply didn't exist. The structure of the church was already more closely tied to political authority. There was no single figure like the Pope whose removal would suddenly grant rulers more control. In fact, many leaders already had significant influence over religious institutions within their territories. Figures like Ivan the Terrible viewed the church as a tool for unity, not an obstacle to power. From their perspective, introducing Protestant ideas didn't offer advantages, it threatened to destabilize everything. And they had seen what was happening in the West: revolts, division, and unrest. For Orthodox rulers, the choice was clear. Supporting the Reformation wasn't a path to greater control. It was a risk they had no reason to take. Despite overwhelming resistance, there was one moment when everything almost changed. A single figure emerged who seemed willing to bridge the gap between Orthodox tradition and Protestant ideas. This was Patriarch Cyril Lucaris, a man deeply familiar with Western theology. In 1629, he introduced a bold new vision, one that incorporated elements of Protestant belief, particularly those associated with Calvinist thought. It was a radical move, one that immediately sent shockwaves through the Orthodox world. Some questioned whether the ideas truly came from him, but the impact was undeniable. For many, this wasn't reform, it was betrayal. The reaction was swift and intense. Lucaris faced constant opposition, removed from power multiple times, and ultimately met a grim fate. His attempt didn't spark a movement. It triggered a backlash. What could have been the beginning of change instead became a warning. It showed just how far the Orthodox Church was willing to go to protect its traditions, and how little space there was for ideas that challenged its foundations. In the years that followed, the Orthodox Church made its position unmistakably clear. Any lingering uncertainty about Protestant ideas was brought to an end through decisive action. In 1672, a major council was held that would define the Church's stance for generations. Here, key Protestant doctrines were formally examined and rejected. Ideas like Scripture alone and faith alone were not just dismissed, they were condemned as incompatible with true belief. At the same time, the council reaffirmed the importance of tradition, rituals, and long-standing teachings that had shaped Orthodox identity for centuries. This wasn't just a theological decision, it was a declaration. A clear line had been drawn, and there would be no crossing it. From that moment on, the possibility of a reformation within the Orthodox world was no longer just unlikely, it was impossible.
The door that had briefly opened in the early days was now firmly shut, ensuring that while Western Christianity transformed dramatically, the Orthodox Church would remain on its own distinct path.